Good morning, good evening, good night, wherever and whenever you are. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is episode 23 of the Subversive Liberty Podcast. Well, hello and welcome everybody to another episode. We have a fun one for you today. We are going to be dissecting and discussing this issue of net neutrality, which has taken over everybody's lives this week. So let's get into it.
And it keeps me from believing is that liberty dies not among outcries but thunderous applause. Every single day I'm just trying to tell the world something. Will you listen? No matter what they say, time cannot move the other way.
Well, hello again and welcome once more to the Subversive Liberty Podcast. I am your host, Brian Thornton Jr. You can follow me on all forms of social media at that web address, at Brian Thornton Jr. Just search it in Google. I pop right up, or you can go to subversiveliberty.org/subscribe. So today, we are going to be talking about what at least appears to be a very serious issue in a lot of people's lives. I guess you could also call this episode day 3 of recording after net neutrality. I can't tell you guys what I had to do to get this episode out there. I had to sit in my room and record it, and then I had to upload it onto YouTube. And if you're watching this, then I guess they didn't decide to charge me $1 million to do so, which is of course what everyone's talking about with this issue. Everyone seems to have a lot of ideas as to how the internet is going to be looking over the next 10 years. And I don't know how much of that actually will hold up to reality. I'd venture a guess and say it probably wouldn't. But before we start talking about the specifics of net neutrality, and I'll talk a little bit about how the episode is going to go, we're going to be... I was told when I went to a website about supporting net neutrality to watch a John Oliver video first of all things, and that would be how I would learn about this. That would be how I learn about this problem, this issue. And so I decided to go ahead and take their advice on that, and I watched a John Oliver interview, and not an interview, it was his monologue, and there were some things in there that I thought he could use some tips on, and certainly I think everyone else could as well. This isn't really an episode where I'm like looking to smack down arguments or make everyone feel bad for thinking a certain way. I'm really hoping to give you some peace of mind, especially if you're somebody listening to this who has been fanatical in your support for the so-called net neutrality, and are feeling completely devastated in Trump's America for one thing or another that has happened. And I really hope I can kind of let's try and calm down the rhetoric a little bit around this situation, because this has certainly become something that's been almost entirely taken up by politicians, political types. It's infused with political language, starting with its title. So before I even address any arguments, let's talk about what we're actually discussing here. Because this, like many government programs, has a wonderful little name that everyone loves to get around and feels like, well, if the name says something, that it must be true. I guess also before we start, I need to ask you something. I need to ask that you grant me the chance, just the chance, that there might have been something that a lot of people missed in this net neutrality debate, and that more importantly, there is a different way of looking at things, which is what I'm going to present today, about how we should, quote unquote, regulate the internet. So, net neutrality. Like the Patriot, this is, governments love to call their programs very benign, very simple, use very simple words, very benign phrases, and use things that are going to get people to jump out of their seats. So, for example, the Patriot Act, right, which completely got rid of any semblance of a Fourth Amendment, which allows the government to spy on American citizens without a warrant. We have the, the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which is a part of all this. And that, that allows for the detainment of American citizens, again, without probable cause. Provided they are terrorists or something. But of course, what is a terrorist and who qualifies as such is ultimately open to the government's interpretation in this matter, which is what people would say is an issue. It's too much power given to the government to begin with. So just like the fact that the Patriot Act had nothing to do with patriotism, just like the fact that the Affordable Care Act did not automatically make healthcare affordable, the FCC creating new regulations and changing the way that they regulate the internet does not necessarily make the internet neutral, right? I think this is apparent on the face of it. I think that most people kind of would recognize this intuitively in most cases. But unfortunately, again, when political language comes involved, when you have every single major talking head who all work for big corporations, by the way, telling you that you should go and support something, it becomes very difficult at times if you don't have the proper knowledge base to counteract it, to understand how anybody could disagree with you. And in fact, that seems to be at least some of the initial reactions to how people have reacted to me when I've said that I don't quote unquote support net neutrality. Which is really, you know, again, before we even get into the arguments of what John Oliver presented, it is kind of laughable on the face of things. First off, the idea that, you know, government policy is quote unquote neutral, but then more importantly, that I don't think that the internet should be an open and free source of information. I absolutely do believe that it's entirely within within my principles to believe so. And in fact, I would love to hold the ISPs accountable, and to make sure that they do keep the internet somewhat neutral, and that they're not that some of these boogeymen that people have been talking about don't pop up. And we'll get into some of those later at the end of the episode. But first, we are going to work our way through John Oliver. Now, this may come as a shock to some people, but this is actually the first time I have ever sat down through an entire John Oliver monologue. It was about, I think the entire video is 13 minutes. Everything that I'm going to be talking about today, guys, will be linked at subversiveliberty.org. You can just find episode 23 there. There will be links in the YouTube video. There will be links in the show notes on SoundCloud. And then on your favorite podcatchers. So you're going to be able to see the videos that I'm using, that I'm pulling from. You're going to be able to see some of the articles that I'm going to talk about later on. And, you know, there's going to be some other articles that I don't even get to, but that present a similar case, that are there for your reading and your benefit. Because again, this really just requires that you look at the situation differently, and or really, if you have to think more carefully about how knowledge in society is used. Specifically, and then also like what government regulations tend to do. So without further ado, let's click on over. Well, I'm going to click on over. You guys are just going to sit there and listen. We're going to click on over, and let's start at what. So, you know, so I have a problem a little bit with this kind of, you know, we talk a lot about fake news, but in some ways this medium is exactly fake news, and yet it has become, because it's meant to be comedic. I'm not like insulting anybody who works on the show. In fact, John Oliver seems like a nice dude. I'm sure he's chill. But I really take issue with, you know, not comedians can be smart. There's comedians that I like and I listen to for their opinions. But what bothers me is when you have a perfect show that is completely produced and timed down to a T, and when you're constantly making jokes, you're making people laugh while giving them the semblance of that they can actually think about something. So what we're going to do is basically go through, try and remove ourselves from the 10 minutes of jokes, and get down to the basically 3 minutes of arguments that John Oliver brings up. So without further ado, take it away, John.
Net neutrality is actually hugely important. Essentially, it means that all data has to be treated equally, no matter who creates it. It's why the internet is a weirdly level playing field. And startups can supplant established brands. That's how Facebook supplanted MySpace, which supplanted Friendster, which supplanted actually having any friends.
Really funny, right? Really good joke. You know, that it supplanted having any friends. Of course, all of this happened before net neutrality, guys, right? I'm not bringing out anything new here. In fact, without the internet being regulated by the FCC, without the internet ever having a thought to deal with the FCC, because they treat it as an information service project and not a public utility, and that's what's at issue here, is really that simple regulatory distinction. we had basically the burgeoning of the online life that we all lead today. And then there's this, and so there's this constant meme, and this is what is pushed a lot of times with government regulation. Oh, well, obviously, Brian, the government needs to make sure that all the data is treated neutrally. However, that couldn't be farther from the truth as to how like your data is actually used. For example, I own a website. I bought the domain to subversiveliberty.org. I get it through Bluehost is who controls it. And they have different plans that will determine the amount of traffic I can get to my website at any one time. So if this episode blows up and I get millions of hits onto the website, chances are the website might go down because I don't pay for enough bandwidth. I don't pay for enough storage server space with the person who hosts my website that to support that. And if the website, and this is the same thing for businesses, but this is why businesses will pay more for more internet speeds. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because it starts right when you have a website, you pay for the server. You pay for some sort of server website to host it for you, or you can build one yourself if you have the means. But most people tend to just pay somebody else to do it, and so that website is going to host that server farm, which is like a bunch of computers sitting in a room, is going to host all the information, and then it is then incumbent upon them to get the information from there to the consumer when they try and log on the website. And they do this by using the cables that internet service providers, which are really just cable companies, and we're going to get into why it's mostly that in a little bit, along with John Oliver's argument. And so this whole idea of like the net has to be neutral, doesn't make sense because price it. If you make everything cost the same, then you're just going to have bad service for people, bad service for everybody, right? If you tier the service, if you offer different levels for different prices, people can choose based off their budget what they want to pay, and they can then you can pay for more if you want it, and you can pay for less. And really, that's going to be that's kind of going to be at the heart of the issue here, is whether that really is the heart of the issue here, is whether or not these internet service providers are in fact able to control the cables that they have spent all the money laying, notwithstanding whether the taxpayer monies were used to build those cables as well. That can complicate issues, and like I said, we're going to get into that a little bit. But just remember, in that little itty bitty opening right there, all that usurpation that occurred in the forms of social media that we like to use, all of that happened without net neutrality. And in fact, if I need to remind you, net neutrality as such only was implemented in 2015. It was only in 2015 that the FCC changed their classification of the internet from an information service to a public utility. And really, public utility law is kind of at the heart of this issue here. But let's move on. So he's going to finish the joke, and then we'll go on to the next point.
The point is, the internet in its current form is not broken, and the FCC is currently taking steps to fix that.
The FCC is endorsing new rules that could clear the way for a two-tier system.
The rules would open the door for the first time for internet providers like Comcast and Verizon to charge tech companies to send content to consumers more quickly. Netflix, for example, might pay a premium to ensure that its customers can stream movies more reliably at a cost a startup competitor might not be able to afford.
No, it's to make them go away.
Okay. So that's the first part of the argument that's going to be presented here. So there is the potential for so-called fast lanes to be used by internet service providers. If you listened carefully, and of course, if you were just watching John Oliver when this was aired, you were probably just giggling at his jokes. If you listen carefully, you'll notice that what they are talking about is not charging consumers more for the product, but instead charging the content companies more for better bandwidth. And you might ask yourself, well, why is it that where's my notes? Sorry, I had to pull up my notes. Why is it that we need to worry about Netflix? Why does Netflix need to pay more to internet service companies? Why do they want it to begin with? Well, it has to do with a few different things. One is that Netflix and Amazon are competing for for the service that the cable companies also provide. And so that you might see there's a conflict of interest there that occurs when all of our internet service providers are also our cable companies, that they might want to prioritize people watching and paying for cable instead of streaming things and binging things on Netflix. And of course, this is something that we're seeing in the market play itself out right now completely, guys. Like, this is absolutely changing. Like, websites like Netflix, websites like YouTube have absolutely changed the way we consume and watch things, right? Like, we have the term binge watching now. This wouldn't have been done. This couldn't have been done before the internet. And so there's changes that need to be occurred. And so what we're seeing, they say that the FCC possibly, this is the other thing, right? If you missed it in there, they said that this is a possible thing that's going to happen, that this is going to maybe occur. And really what this has to do with is the fact that Netflix and really other services now, because there's this one of the articles that'll be up there. It's from Variety. I thought it was a decent article that I found. Something like Netflix controls somewhere around 40% of all potential bandwidth during peak hours, which means that, like 40%, I think the best, when we're talking about bandwidth, the best metaphor I've found to be used is something like a highway. And then, the information are like trucks and cars on the highway. And so there's only a certain amount of space that can be used to transport information from point A to point B, being like the server farm to your home. And so imagine if 40% of that road at any one given time, because it's not exactly like a car, right? It doesn't have a beginning and an end. It has like, it's just a constant stream from one end to another. So another, you might also think of like a hose that has multiple streams of water flowing through it, multiple colors that manage to stay separate within there, right? It's not a perfect metaphor because, it's not exactly like what happens in anywhere else because it's the internet. It's something different. It's like electricity. It's like the fact that there can only be so much electricity that goes over the cords. And Netflix, because we as consumers enjoy the service and want to use it more, Netflix accounts for a lot of the traffic. And so what happened is that Comcast specifically throttled their service in like 2014 or something. And in fact, that's going to be the next click. So let's watch that real quick.
That black line plummeting downwards.
So if you look at the black line, it goes really far down if you're listening. In January 2014.
When Netflix agreed to Comcast demands. I'll give you a hint. It's right there. That has all the ingredients of a mob shakedown. Oh, Netflix.
So he's, comparing the cable companies to mobsters, which I'm frankly not even opposed to. Like I said, we're going to get into the actual issue here, which is not the fact that the federal government has decided to take a step back and not have as much control over the internet. But if you were watching at home, or if you're listening, to this, that was basically like Netflix streaming services over time. And what you see is in January of 2014, and a little bit before that, when Comcast was approaching Netflix and said, "Hey, we want more money for you to get better service and better bandwidth." You'd see it go down, and then it goes right back up again, and then goes to the biggest one. And so around this time, actually, if you guys recall, this was when, and I went to look it up because I wanted to be sure, this was also when Netflix raised its prices. So here's what's happening. Everyone's using Netflix. Everyone wants to be using Netflix, and so they're using up a lot of the bandwidth, which means there's not as much space for the internet service provider to push out other information for people in other areas. So they approach Netflix and say, "Hey, you guys are using too much of our bandwidth, and we need to charge you we want to charge you a premium for it." To which Netflix was saying, no, and then they finally said yes, and then everything's fine. And so you might wonder, with all this money that's being added to this service, what is it that we're going to be using? How much is Netflix going to cost? Well, of course, they only raised the price by $1 for new customers. And I think there might have been a couple raises, and of course Netflix just changed the way that they do plans and how many screens you can have. Of course, all this kind of innovation needs to happen in an open marketplace when we're talking about a new service or product. There's nothing precedented about the internet. There is nothing precedented about a Netflix and the degree to which people enjoy the service. Full stop. Right? And one thing that entrepreneurs, that businesses, that individuals, that consumers do is they look at the prices and they use those prices to make determinations. And the price of something holds a lot of information. And so as it stands, people are willing to spend $10 a month for a bunch of movies that they're never going to watch, for the few movies and TV shows that they are. That's in some ways what Netflix is, right? Like, there's a million things on there probably that I will never see. And there are probably hundreds of things that I have absolutely no interest of watching that are on Netflix, but they do to other people. And by paying into it, I get access to the things that I like. And so it is worth that to me. But Netflix has to get the information, again, from the server farm to the consumer. And that's where the ISP comes in. That's where the cable company comes in. But, and John Oliver, frankly, does a really good job of talking about how cable companies are monopolies. So let's go to the next one.
Verizon wants a two-tier system so badly, they sued the government to force the rule change that's currently being discussed. These companies have Washington in their pockets to a conveniently almost unbelievable degree.
Comcast has spent $18,810,000 in lobbying last year. That's more than any other company except for defense contractor Northrop Grumman.
And he does this quite well in the video, but, okay, so we're talking about the number 2 lobbying group, and this was probably from a couple of years ago, this information. The number 2 lobbying group is second only to a defense contractor, only second to the military-industrial complex. Let's talk a little bit about lobbying for a minute, because this is the first part, and at least in my opinion, where the argument for net neutrality starts to break down. Because this is always the way it goes, right? You have so-called concerned citizens, activists who want to do something, and then this is part of his argument later on too. He talks about how if the activists and the corporations are on the same side, well, then it must be good. Of course, it doesn't necessarily follow from that at all that that's the best course of action to take, and in fact, I would argue that it's not. In fact, if you see the big corporations supporting a policy, then you might wonder why it is, because chances are it's going to serve their self-interests. So Comcast spends millions of dollars. And again, I want to talk a little bit about lobbying and how lobbying is done, right? Because what companies are able to do is by spending millions of dollars paying these lobbyists, which are people who go and try and advocate for particular policy positions on Capitol Hill, both at the state, the local, and the federal level. They spend millions of dollars on these things to basically bribe politicians, convince them, wine them, dine them, tell them why it's an important thing. And then in many cases, they actually work with them to craft the legislation, or they actually write the regulation and legislation themselves and give it to the government. And then the government person goes, okay, great, this is awesome. This is already done. My work is finished. I don't have to read through this. We're just going to pass this. And if you think I'm kidding, I'm not. This is the kind of stuff that happens in Washington, D.C. all the time. A bunch of patchwork regulations that are written by multiple different lobbying groups at the behest of special interests. So, again, if immediately it becomes fairly obvious that regulation, in that it is crafted, in that it is implemented, in that it is conceived, has almost nothing to do with the consumer, has almost nothing to do with the common man, as it were, the individual on the street who is not connected and not part of this system. But you want to believe that somehow in this process, where these millions of dollars are being spent, that the company is not going to get the best ride out of things. There were multiple car companies in the United States as it came up, and it wasn't until the big three got together during FDR's administration to write the regulations that we started to see it petering out. Regulation inhibits competition by its nature. Regulation protects the big business by its nature. That's what regulation actually does, guys, because it's not some. And it might be, okay, it honestly might be in certain instances, but what it's not most of the time, it's not some do-gooder who wants to come in and make the world a better place, right? It's some politically connected hack who got this appointment because of his, I don't know, maybe donations to the Obama administration, like the previous FCC commissioner who implemented net neutrality in 2015. Remember, we're only talking about 2 years. I think the internet was pretty good 3 or 4 years ago. I think it's going to continue to be okay, provided we have competition. But a little bit more on this, because yes, the cable companies are absolutely monopolistic in the way that they at the local level, and this has a lot more to do, and this issue really has a lot more to do with local control as opposed to federal control. We got a couple more clips to get through, so let's do that, and then we're going to talk a little bit about that idea.
overseeing their own oversight. It is hardly surprising that cable companies are basically monopolies now. A federal study found that 96% of the population had access to 2 or fewer cable broadband providers. It's almost as
I really like when I watch these kinds of things sometimes how they have to use real statistics to back up their arguments, of course, and that those real statistics go to prove the point of the free market standpoint and not the further government control standpoint. Because again, it's not because of some glorious free market that that cable companies can act like monopolies, right? It is because of the monopolies that were granted not only at the local level but at the federal level that enable these companies to be monopolistic. There's one more I want to show you about this one's about Estonia and download speeds in the US.
We pay more for our internet service than almost anybody else on Earth, and yet the download speeds we get lag behind Estonia. Estonia!
What a great joke. This one actually really upset me. Of course, because if you know anything, you would know that Estonia is one of the hotbeds for economic freedom in the former Soviet bloc, and that a lot of these countries have managed to do is embrace a more free market attitude, a low regulatory environment, a pro entrepreneurship environment. And in fact, most of them have also been able to start developing because of the horrors of communism since the 90s. And whereas most of the infrastructure that we are working off of here in the United States was built well before that, because we've been developed for longer. And this is actually kind of about like capital costs a little bit, because there's a capital investment that needs to go in. There's investment that needs to happen in order to provide these services. And so what countries like Estonia have been able to do, simply by the fact of when they started developing, is use better service and better products. On top of that, though, guys, here's the thing. They rank really high on the Freedom Index. I have the link right here. They were like number on the Index of Economic Freedom, which is a big one. Which is a big one that comes out every single year. They are they're like in the top 20. And then, of course, I think the United States is in the 30s at the moment. And I'll have that to link. You can find out if I'm wrong. If this loads in a second, I'll be able to tell you that I was wrong or right, depending on what it was. But they also have really high ratings, though, guys. This is what's important. You're going to laugh at the fact that Estonia, and he goes on to talk about how it looks like this idyllic, almost castle, ancient type of country, right? You're going to go and make a joke about Estonia because that plays well with American audiences who don't really care about the Eastern Bloc unless they are interested in these things. Yeah, Estonia is 6 on this list, and the United States is number 17. So they rank far higher from us in business climate. That uses the Index of Economic Freedom uses a multiple input level of regulatory environment. How big the state is, what kind of tax brackets they have, yada yada yada, all goes to show and to tell that Estonia is actually doing much better as far as government policy than the United States is, and that probably has a lot to do with the fact that they are actually getting higher and better download speeds. Because of course, one thing that John Oliver and I can seemingly agree on.
We're just going to let them. And you know why? It all comes back to this.
Oh, wait, we're not going to agree on this point. We are going to agree on the fact that cable companies are absolutely monopolistic. And like most monopolies, actually, and like all monopolies, real monopolies that are bad, it is because of government protectionism. It is because of government regulation that those things are set up. And if you've never heard this line of argument before, I really encourage you to go and check out the links that I have at the website. And you can just go to Mises.org, you can go to fee.org, you can go to a number of good websites where not only can you find current commentary and podcasts and everything like that, you're also going to be able to find original sourcing material, like actual theoretic work done by economists, by political philosophers, to talk about this school of thought. Because again, I don't see how it's not entirely obvious to people that regulations are written by big businesses, because that's always been the case historically. That's who actually comes through. And so John Oliver actually has a theory for why all this is happening.
And we're just going to let them. And you know why? It all comes back to this.
It seeks comment on ways to construe additional language in Section 706 and even suggests using Section 230B to broaden the scope of the Commission's usurped authority.
Oh my God, how are you?
How are you still talking? That's how he finishes that joke. Of course, that is a very good joke. And I guess I should apologize for not having as flashy of a studio as he does. I don't have a bunch of people sitting in the audience that are going to clap at my every word. What I'm trying to do instead is to talk about this issue as frankly as I can, using the knowledge that I have, and give you a different perspective on things. Because of course, what he says is the reason why this is a problem is because, of course, it's because this is just boring and people don't care. And of course, look, there is some boring technical stuff that goes into regulation. I'm certainly not going to call the government anything close to funny or entertaining. I think it can be at certain times, but for the most part, it's not. So here's what's really at issue, guys. So that's the John Oliver argument, and this is the argument that's getting at net neutrality. I'm going to piece together his arguments real quick before I go through and give my thoughts. So, cutting out the 10 minutes of jokes, we can piece together his arguments. There was a court decision in 2014 that struck down a ruling. This is what he was talking about with Verizon suing, that the FCC couldn't tell cable companies to throttle service, which means they might have services like Netflix and Amazon pay for more bandwidth they use, which is about 40% during peak hours. Interesting to note that this is from like one year to another, from like 2015 to 2016. This changed. Netflix went down, Amazon went up. This might be because people are using the service more, but it's also because Netflix coders figured out better ways to encode the data, right? So one of the issues is that sending HD is a lot of data. If you guys do any work, with video, with audio, like I've been doing for the podcast, you realize how big these files can actually get. It's actually quite incredible. I think if I remember back to like my first MP3 player, which wasn't an iPod, if I remember back, that thing could only hold like 16 songs at one point in time, and that was considered like decent technology. Of course, it wasn't an iPod, but it was like an off-brand. I don't even remember the name of it, the maker of it. It was just a whatever MP3 player, but it could only hold about 16 songs. We have managed to create new and better ways to fit more information on smaller and smaller platforms. This is an amazing thing that's happened in a largely unregulated market, and if we continue to go forward, I think things will only get better. The other big, actually, that reminds me of the other example that people tend to talk about in regards to favoring net neutrality is that what is it called? Metro PCS. They had like some special plan where they gave you unlimited streaming of YouTube. But not Netflix and Amazon. And oh my God, people can't watch the video that they want to watch, and that's horrible because that's really what we're talking about here. This is fantastic. This is like ridiculous when you actually start to think about it. What the entire crux of this argument is basically whether cable companies get to charge these content providers more and pass the costs off onto consumers that way, or they just have to pretend they're not passing the costs off onto consumers for the massive amounts of bandwidth that these video services use. Because that's what's happening. People are still going to be using Netflix, and of course, the only companies that are really at issue here are companies like YouTube, Netflix, and Amazon, and other ones, and Vimeo. And this is all, and I don't really get the whole argument of like, oh well, if there's a fast lane, then you're not going to be able to get to another website as quickly. How many other websites do y'all go to? I mean, this is an honest question, right? Like, do you actually use a lot more things besides Netflix, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and a couple other things? Because most people use stuff on their phones, and of course it's apps that you use on your phone. You don't use a web browser. I would argue that you don't even have to go to our website to listen to our stuff. You can just find it on Facebook. You can subscribe to us in some sort of RSS feeder and just get everything right there on your phone. So you never actually have to visit the website, which please go ahead and do so that you're reading our content. But if you go to subversiveliberty.org, that would be cool too, because that way I can see how many people are checking out the site. Because this is not something that's I don't see this as something that's going to completely kill the internet. I don't see this as something that's going to actually change the way we view things. It might. You know what? It absolutely might. I completely grant you the possibility that we could have some serious issues in the future with as far as speeds, as far as the type of access we can have on the internet. But it's not going to be the FCC that fixes things. There's only one thing that can fix things. There's only one thing that can make sure that things get better and stay better. And that is allowing for competition and innovation. This is the most important thing, man. If you don't recognize the importance of these things, then you start to fall into the trap of thinking regulation is going to fix it, when it doesn't. Again, I've already established, and this is provable. I'm not like, this is not some crazy conspiracy theory that I'm peddling here. It is not the fact that that regulations are passed for the people. No, they're passed by lobbyists, man. They're passed by people who have a special interest. It's literally special interests that go to the government. There was a team in Yale that discovered this 20 years ago, that America is not a democracy and we're not a republic. We're some sort of oligarchy where special interests control the people in Congress. They're going to be able to give way more money to politicians than I ever could, or ever would, frankly, that I would ever think to give to them. They're going to do it. Why? Because it benefits them. And they're going to give it to people like at the FCC, and they're going to hire those people when they come out, when they're done doing their term of public service. Guess where they go? They go into the private sector, which means they go into lobbying groups. That's what happens to these old politicians who have been there for years and years and years, and they finally decide to retire from Congress. They can't do another job, so what do? They get paid by the big businesses to go and make sure their friends back on Capitol Hill are going to pass the bills they want and the regulations that they want. And oh, look, here, man, here's all the regulation written for you. You don't have to do anything. It's really frustrating when it's assumed that people who take a different approach to this issue. And all I'm saying is that the FCC should not be changing the regulation of the internet to a public utility, which is all that's at issue here. This is kind of the most interesting thing, because there are other like net neutrality things, and I'm not opposed to the idea of the net being neutral, except for the fact that the net is not neutral, cannot be neutral, and that the government cannot enforce enforce those standards on people. It is physically impossible by the nature of the way government looks like, by what they do, by the way that they act. Government cannot actually be neutral. Government is not a neutral actor, guys. There's some theory stuff behind this that I'm kind of relying on right now. And actually, make sure you subscribe to the show if you're listening to this for the first time, because I do plan on doing a couple more philosophy and economics centered episodes as opposed to current events as the year closes out. And certainly going into 2018, I have a lot of ideas for some of the stuff that I want to try and show you guys and explain, which again just provides a different perspective on things, a perspective that does not require government force at the highest levels. So maybe I've lost you. Maybe you think I'm crazy. Maybe you think I'm ridiculous, and that's fine. Like you can think however you want, and you can think whatever you want. I'm happy that the government isn't going to be doing this. Well, it's not even that the government's not going to be doing this anymore, right? Because so if it's an information service, which is what the internet is regulated as currently with the removal of the rules, it falls under the jurisdiction of the FTC, which is a court, which are judges, which generally speaking, I actually find to be far more preferable, to a massive bureaucracy controlling things. And so this is a consumer advocacy judge shit. Like you can go file a complaint with the FTC, and they will hear your claims. And this is how you can sue the cable companies. Or you can sue your internet service provider, you can sue a content provider, what have you. The FTC is available and specifically there for that purpose. And so that's all that really happened. That's all that really happened is you switch the jurisdiction from being more under the FCC control to back under the FTC control. Very little actually changed. This isn't really that big of a win for liberty, despite what some people might tell you. I think it's a step in the right direction, and I'll take a win where I can get it, so to speak. But this is it's not really going to be affecting things. It's not going to be affecting things too much. Now, what we might see, you might see Comcast and Netflix and Amazon and other service providers start to now negotiate for increased bandwidth, which in turn will probably mean you see a price in the consumers. But here's the thing: there's a reason for those prices, right? Like people are using these services constantly. If they weren't, this wouldn't be a big issue. So this is entrepreneurs reflecting. This is businesses responding to customer demands, and what the government's trying to do is basically like hold everything up and freeze it in place and create a non-existent type of market that could possibly occur. Now, I mentioned earlier, and this is really the most important part of the episode, in many ways. I talked about earlier how this really comes down to the local monopolies that are granted by different businesses and such, or by different local municipalities. And in fact, I have a great article here from Wired that I found. If you guys watched the little teaser video I did, the Subversive Minute, that went out on Friday, I asked the question. I said, if you thought about net neutrality, you'd wondered why a company like Google Fiber isn't available in every major city. Well, this is a great little article, and again, this is going to be linked, so you can check this out yourself to figure this out for yourself. And so this it starts off: despite public, political, and business interests in greater broadband deployment, not every American has high-speed internet access yet. There's, again, we talked about the Estonia thing that they developed their infrastructure later. There's also the fact that the United States is just far larger than most of these European countries. While popular arguments focus on supposed monopolists such as big cable companies, it's government that's really to blame. Companies can make life harder for their competitors, but strangling the competition takes government. Let's see. Before this is kind of the important part of the article, so I would hope that you listen to this. Before building out new networks, internet service providers must negotiate with local governments for access to publicly owned rights of way, so they can place their wires above and below both public and private property. ISPs also need pole attachment contracts with public utilities so they can rent space on utility poles for above ground wires or in ducts and conduits for wires laid underground. The problem: local governments and their public utilities charge ISPs far more than these things actually cost. For example, rights of way and pole attachment fees can double the cost of network construction. So the real bottleneck isn't on providers of broadband, but incumbent on, this is actually, wow, I didn't even notice how poorly that this paragraph is written, but is a question of the rights of way, the providers of the rights of way. The real monopolists also have a final say of whether an ISP can build a network. So this is kind of where I was getting at, where I said, oh, isn't it interesting that an ISP is pretty much the same thing as a cable company? So a long time ago, the government decided that they had the right to regulate not only our electricity, but our water, our phone, pretty much everything. And they called these things public utilities. And this is exactly the type of thing that the FCC was trying to accomplish with the internet. And what has happened throughout all of this, as we see in Flint, Michigan, is the worst case scenario, is the absolute most disgusting case scenario, is that because water is a right and you're required to, and you should absolutely have it, well, that means the government should provide for it. And then what eventually happens is the government's not going to pay to keep things up, and so there are kids that are getting lead poisoning because of it in 2017 when that shouldn't happen. Whereas because they leased they leased it out to really crappy companies, and it was just poor management, because oftentimes the governments, because politicians have such short-term thinking, don't think long-term, and have are poor managers of these necessary and vital resources. And of course, this was really an entire episode in and of itself. The problem with treating things as public utilities, and also bringing in a little public choice theory to show exactly why that is the case. So I would definitely recommend you guys look those up. But in the interim, we have a company like Google, which Google is not a small company. Google has, it's Alphabet now, right? Alphabet is the big corporation that controls, that's over all the different parts of Google. And they had this idea called Google Fiber, which is now only available in a couple of cities and not available in really any big cities throughout the country, even though they had originally planned to roll this out. And you're telling me that a company like Google couldn't figure this out? No, they could figure this out, but local municipalities consistently at every single level would fight them, would help out their buddy probably who works for Comcast, I would assume at one point, or maybe her buddy that works for Time Warner, to make sure that that they keep their business, because of course most people only have two cable providers, and that's what's really at issue here, folks. We shouldn't be looking to the federal government to solve this issue. We should be holding local governments accountable for the crap for the crap hand they've dealt us. People should be supporting legislation and local initiatives that allow for any cable provider to come and build wires out to the area. Because from a business standpoint, those things take a long time, and there's investment, there's manpower that goes into putting these things in, which is precisely why cable companies, as they exist currently, in my opinion, have the right to decide what they charge for the bandwidth to go over it. And keep in mind, guys, they are ultimately dependent upon the consumers. And also keep in mind that, like, even though Wi-Fi is probably what we use most of the time, you can get unlimited data plans from your data service provider, from your cell phone provider. So it's not like it's a strictly competition, but certainly the ISP and like fast internet and being able to upload videos and watch a bunch of stuff and download a bunch of stuff, it works better when you have a cable connection. And so really, if you want to make things better, if you want to be in a better world where stuff is where service is cheaper, you should be focusing on the local level. You should not be focusing on the federal level. I think the best metaphor that I can use to describe this would be like getting a python to save yourself from a viper bite, right? So like, there are two types of snakes. There are like poisonous snakes, and then there are constrictors. And so the poisonous snakes have fangs and they get you, and they have the venom in there, and the venom's what kills you. And then there's the constrictors, which just slowly wrap around you ever so slowly. And then they finally decide to squeeze you, and then they eventually squeeze the life out of you. And so the in this metaphor, local governments, local municipalities, even state governments to a certain extent are the viper bite, right? That just kills innovation. That just kills the development. That kills the chance for other companies to potentially compete and innovate beyond what the current cable companies actually do. Okay. And then the federal government is the python or the boa constrictor. They are the one who is going to come in and, you can, if you constrict, if you do a tourniquet around your leg, right? Let's say you got bit on the foot. If you do a tourniquet around your leg, you're going to stop the flow of venom, right? So it might, in the interim, in the short term, it might provide some relief to people. It might actually make things a little better in the short term, but in the long term, you're going to be constricted. You're going to have the life sucked out of you, because of course, once everyone's keen on the game, you can bet that the lobbyists are going to be going to the FCC, schmoozing them, taking them out to nice dinners, taking them golfing, inviting them over to their house for a party, all to make sure that the next round of regulations are going to service them. There are no ifs, ands, or buts about it, guys. This is the way that governments operate. This is precisely why I think it's so troublesome that people are so up in arms about this situation. Hold your local governments accountable. Stop looking to the federal government in this paternalistic sense for what you think is the right course of action. And most importantly, if you think I'm wrong, I would actually love to have a conversation about this, because I am obviously not an expert in data services or technology. I am not an expert in that at any stretch of the imagination. What I do know is a little bit of philosophy, a little bit of economics, and a little bit of common sense, I guess I would argue. And I realize that voluntary is better than coercion, and the government is always coercion, and the market is voluntary. And that's the type of society that I want to build. That's the type of society I hope you guys join me in building on this show. So don't forget, if we fear what we do not understand, actually, before I do that, don't forget we have these awesome new segments called the Subversive Minutes on social media. Do me a favor and share those. If you could, share this episode with a friend, if you could be so kind. Don't have to share it to your public wall. You can send in a message. I think that actually works better as far as like getting people to check something out. I really hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I really hope I dissuaded some of the fears. Hopefully you feel a little bit calmer after reading this. Like, if for no other reason, then remember that regulations are written at the behest of big corporations more often than not. And so that maybe these regulations weren't as good for the consumer, for the individual, as we might think. And we can all fight for a freer society by fighting our local governments and the local monopolies that they grant to the cable service providers. Because yes, the internet is absolutely important to everybody. It is one of the best things in the world. Oh, this is actually one point, and I know this is a throwaway at the end, which is kind of annoying, but like, for the important things in life, like reading, it doesn't take a lot of bandwidth. So there's if you were worried about the internet for like the free flow of information, well, text doesn't take a lot to transport. So you can read very easily, and even a low data plan you'll be able to load. If you think I'm wrong, think of the internet like 10, 15 years ago, before video streaming became so popular, right? So even in this worst case scenario where you have to pay for tiered service, if you're worried about people educating themselves and bettering their position, they're going to be able to do that, even with some sort of fast lane and all the horrible things that might happen. But anyway, remember, if we fear what we do not understand, the answer must be to try to understand everything. So I hope you have a good morning, a good evening, and good night.